First of all, tell me a little bit about the processes for this. How many people you interviewed and how reliable you believe these results are.
At Emerson College Polling, we used a mixed mode methodology on this and all of the surveys that we conduct. In the statewide Ohio poll that we just conducted, looking ahead towards the May primary, we used a mixed mode methodology that integrated three different types of data collection. First, IVR data collection, where we call landlines with a robocall, and respondents are instructed to type in the answer to each question they are asked. We also sample using an online methodology where respondents take the survey through an online service. And lastly, we use SMS to text messaging, which means respondents get a link with the survey, which they take in their mobile and web browser.
And so, how many people were interviewed?
723 people were interviewed for the entire poll. Within the Republican primary, the sample was 410, and within the Democratic primary, the sample was 313.
How can you be sure when the sample is relatively small, when you consider there are 11 million people in this state? How can you be sure of the accuracy of this?
Every poll has a margin of error that accompanies it. That means that you can expect the results of the poll to fall reliably within that margin of error. For a poll of 723 individuals, that margin of error is 3.6%, and that's plus or minus. Within the Republican and Democratic primaries, we have a larger margin of error to account for the fact that there are less individuals participating in those subsets.
So that margin of error, does that seem to be in line with what this kind of polling usually does? Because it does seem like the margin of error is high.
The margin of error is higher because you're dealing with such a small subset, and we're looking a couple of months out from the election. As we get closer towards the election, we use a higher sample size, which allows our margin of error to become smaller.
As you looked at the results, what stuck out to you? Anything that took you by surprise?
In this poll, we're dealing with both the Republican primary and the Democratic primary. In the Republican primary, you're dealing with an incumbent governor, Mike DeWine. What we found is we asked individuals whether or not they generally approve of the job that Mike DeWine is currently doing as governor of Ohio. Those numbers were interesting because we found that Mike DeWine had the highest approval among Democratic voters, followed by Republican voters, followed by independent voters. That means that independent voters are currently the ones who are seeing DeWine less favorably. We found that this translated into the ballot test because Republican primary consisted more so of independent voters than the Democratic primary did. Since Ohio is an open primary state, where those independent voters decide to vote, whether in the Democratic primary or Republican primary, is very important. How we saw this kind of coming in relation to Mike DeWine's approval numbers is we saw that those independent voters who were viewing DeWine less favorably are inclined to be participating in that Republican primary. That's part of what contributes to where DeWine stands, which in the Republican primary for governor, he does not have a plurality of support. Rather, a plurality of voters are still undecided in that primary.
Yeah, and that kind of bodes well, doesn't it, for Jim Renacci? I mean, these poll results have to be something that, for an incumbent governor, do you generally see these kinds of results?
The fact that the gubernatorial race has a plurality of voters undecided is unusual considering that Mike DeWine is running as an incumbent. But right now we see that those who have made up their minds in the Republican primary for governor have not coalesced around one candidate or the other. We have both Blystone and Renacci at 20 and 9% support respectively, which means that voters haven't coalesced around one of them over DeWine yet.
Now, as you looked at the results in the Senate race, what stuck out to you as being remarkable?
Our numbers in the Republican Senate race show that there's no clear frontrunner at this point. We have Gibbons at 22%, followed by Mandel at 15%, but there are a couple of other candidates that are still kind of in that conversation. With a plurality of voters still undecided, it's clear that any of these candidates could make a move in the next 2 months. It's really interesting to look at the next question that we asked about the impact of a potential Trump endorsement. Since Trump has not chosen to endorse at this time in the Senate primary, it'll be interesting to see over the next 2 months, if he does choose to endorse, how that makes an impact in the Senate race, as a majority of Republican primary voters say that a Trump endorsement makes them more likely to support a candidate. We also asked a question about the endorsement of Jane Timken by Senator Rob Portman. We found that question particularly interesting because a very small percentage of voters said that that endorsement would make them more likely to vote for Timken. That shows that Portman's endorsement, in comparison to Trump's endorsement, holds much less weight among the Republican primary electorate.
How about in the gubernatorial race? Do you know whether or not the Trump endorsement would have an impact there?
Trump hasn't endorsed in either the gubernatorial or Senate race at this point. Mike DeWine hasn't actively courted Trump's endorsement. So as his number is so low at this point in comparison to the undecided number, it'll be interesting to see if he actively courts that Trump endorsement going forward to bolster his standing.
Or if Renacci does.
Yes, I did see a story about Renacci saying like a former Trump endorsement to kind of get voters to think that Trump is currently on his side, despite him not actually endorsing him this go around yet.
As you know from public polling, that kind of messaging can resonate with some people, right? Even if it's not true.
Yeah, especially when you're seeing that 62% of Republican primary voters holding that endorsement by Trump so strongly.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you surprised at how many undecideds there are as we're, this far into the election season? Some of the Senate race commercials have been running for a year.
There are voters who choose to not tune into the race until just a couple of weeks before the election. What we did see is a trend that Republican voters were more motivated than Democratic primary voters. That means that when we're looking at those proportions next to each other, the proportion of Republicans that said they were very likely was higher than the proportion of Democratic primary voters that said they were very likely. They tended to be more somewhat likely to vote in the primaries.
What else would you like us to know about this poll?
The excitement level among Republicans and Democratic primary voters was also seen in the slightly higher number of Democratic voters that were undecided than in the Republican primary questions. In the Democratic primaries for Senate and governor, there were a majority of voters who are still undecided. That tends to reflect that those voters are not quite tuned into the election as much as those Republican primary voters are at this point.
Democrats and Republicans, you say, are both tuned out. On the Democratic side, it really seems with these two people, statewide unknowns, it's time for them to ramp up, isn't it?
Yes, especially in the Democratic race for governor. You see in that Democratic primary that both candidates are only at 16% each, with a large majority of voters, 69%, being still undecided. With less than 2 months until the election, that's a very high number, which indicates that those candidates really need to be getting their names out more and getting voters to be more familiar with them as the election gets nearer.
Okay, we thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate this polling. Thanks a lot.